This is not a race against the machines. This is a race with the machines.
So how do you want to do this? Maybe give us a bit of a background on the center and how it was created?
I mean, I'm really at your disposal for whatever's most interesting for you. So why don't I tell you a bit about myself, first of all, because I definitely come from a kind of interdisciplinary background as well. So I started originally as a classical musician. I was also a singer, John. I studied at King's College London in London and worked in radio, moved to kind of classical radio for a while, and then kind of found myself being drawn across into documentaries and kind of experimental sound art and experimental radio broadcast. And then ended up at The Guardian for a really long time. I went there to set up their podcast unit when no one really knew what podcasts were in 2006. And it was this wonderful experimental playground where I could do anything. And I ran a podcast team and no one knew really what podcasting was. So I had an amazing large platform and a whole load of journalists to play with, but really like no strict protocols in terms of how to what the output needed to be. So it was a really interesting interesting space for someone who was very interested in sound. And then I moved across to a kind of special projects role there where I could really experiment with storytelling and working with developers and designers and journalists and filmmakers and data people. And I experimented in what experimental storytelling could look like, really within kind of documentary space. My interest has always been kind of human stories and kind of long form documentary rather than news. And then that developed into a role running the virtual reality studio there. So I made this piece called 6x9, which was a piece about solitary confinement in American prisons. And it put you in the position of being incarcerated in a 6 foot by 9 foot cell. And from that piece, we managed to get a big partnership with Google, which meant that I was running a large in-house studio at The Guardian and making a real output of VR pieces. So I did that. I did that for a few years, running our team there, and then I went to Harvard and did a journalism fellowship. The Nieman Journalism Fellowship, which was, reminds me a little bit of the cohort of you. We were all kind of more from journalism or kind of media backgrounds, but there were people from all around the world with all different kinds of interests from Japan and Turkey. And it was just this kind of great year where we could really explore in a way that was very hard within kind of media organizations. And so I then moved to MIT because I wanted somewhere where I could continue to explore more freely than within a media organization that has a very kind of, rightly so, has a kind of remit for its audiences to produce, kind of high quality consumable media, but it means that you can't really experiment and play to the extent that you can within university context. So I moved to a new centre that was being set up at MIT called the Centre for Advanced Virtuality, which is run by my boss, Professor Fox Harrell, who's got a background in AI and in media as well. And the centre's really trying to look at experimental ways to think about this idea of virtuality or virtual presences, and that can be anything from your Facebook presence to AR to VR to AI. So I moved there just over a year ago and started making this project, which I'd got a Mozilla Creative Media Awards grant along with another fellow artist, Halsey Bagund. And we started to make this piece called In Event of Moon Disaster. And the idea was always that it would be a physical installation. So just to recap for those of you who might not have had a chance to look the film up, it's a piece that looks at what deepfakes are and what their potential is by reimagining the 1969 moon landing. And it uses a real piece of documentary material, which is a speech that was written for President Nixon by Bill Safire. So this is a speech that never had to be read by Nixon, thankfully, because the moon landing, as we all know, was successful. But the most dangerous part of that mission was returning the astronauts from the moon on the lunar lander back to the control module, which would take them back to Earth. So this kind of elegy written by Sapphire was written really for that possibility that they'd be left on the moon. So I worked with 2 AI companies, one in Tel Aviv and the other in the Ukraine, who made for us a visual representation of Nixon reading the speech, and then re-speech in the Ukraine made the synthetic Nixon voice. And it was it was quite a long process. They're both very, very high quality kind of production companies that are trying to kind of work in the essentially in the kind of Hollywood area of making high quality synthetic media. And so we made this kind of, I think, pretty realistic deep fake of Nixon reading the speech. But the idea, I guess, my co-director and I are from arts backgrounds, and the idea is that just a speech on its own really wouldn't be that effective, just reading something from the Oval Office and without all the drama and the anticipation of what that actually meant. So being storytellers, we think, where do you start that story? And you start it with the takeoff, with going up into orbit, and then using what misinformation experts call cheap fake techniques. I essentially edited a crash of the lunar lander onto the moon by chopping up bits of footage and editing the sound and reversing bits of footage to make it look like the lunar lander crashes onto the moon's surface, and then we follow that with the deep fake. So the piece started as an installation a year ago at the International Documentary Festival in Amsterdam, and we created a living room set. So the original idea was that we would be inviting people into a kind of semi-watch party-like environment where you would huddle around the television and watch this together. And so we piped the film through a 1966 television. There were adverts looping, and then you'd press a button and the film would start. We created a newspaper which sat alongside the exhibition, which you could take away, which explained why we made the project and how we made it, and what the dangers to democracy are around deep fakes, what the possibilities are for synthetic media, for the arts, and for medical health. And that was the kind of first iteration of the project. And then in July of this year, we launched the digital version of that, which is probably what you have hopefully seen, which had some of those articles that were in that paper, plus an interactive, and we partnered with Scientific American to make a documentary. And so we were really proud of it. It reached a lot of people, like nearly 1 million people have seen the film. It's people have been using the resources in all kinds of ways. We're now building an education module for undergraduates. So it's kind of branched into lots of wings, from art installation to education modules to something that really everyone can see on YouTube or can do on our website. And we're now thinking about how else to expand this project. It seemed to be something that has resonated with people. I think it being a topic that a lot of people love, the moon landing and space. It's not, a lot of the deep fakes out there are very politically divisive. This isn't, even though it is a politician reading it, it's really, we wanted a topic that had a large element of nostalgia that people would love, that didn't divide our audiences, but really showed just how powerful and misleading they can be, as well as potentially creative. AI, synthetic media, can also be creative for artists as well, and has possibilities. So that was the aim of the project. And I think I'm happy to take questions from all you lot, but I think that maybe one of the things that might be interesting is how often I work with really wide ranges of people from very, very different disciplines. Always, the work that I do, whether it's VR or AR or AI or interactive films or binaural podcasts, I'm always working with a wide range of academics and filmmakers and sound artists and architects and people from all kinds of different disciplines, because they bring very different elements. And you know, one of the workshops I often give is about how to come up with kind of strong ideas when you're coming up with concept ideas, but also having like absolute latitude to ditch it all and go in new directions, and how to do those things kind of simultaneously almost. So I think that for me is one of the things about these, you know, very experimental projects, which are far more than me. I have got no coding skills. I still don't really understand how machine learning works. I understand it a little bit now, but it's really like, it is not my speciality, computer science or AI. But what I have got the capacity to do is build really strong partnerships and bring together people from really different backgrounds to create, you know, usually very high quality, immersive, visceral experiences on pro-social topics. So I don't know whether you want to ask me questions or if there are particular things you want me to talk more about specifically, but I'm, you know, whatever is most useful.
I'm just going to ask one question quickly. There's a lot of noise around me. I don't know if you guys can hear that horrible noise, but and then I'll let others ask questions. So, Francesca, there's so many things negative about deepfakes. The name itself, the origin of the technology, the way it's been used originally, very, very aggressive way of doing it. You know, how would you see deepfakes improving social good in 10, 20 years from now? How can we use it for social good, for justice, for the arts, instead of just seeing it as this negative technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, us calling it deepfake is kind of misleading. What this is synthetic media, and then, you know, how you use it depends on whether it's harmful or not. So any kind of media manipulation that doesn't have consent from the actors that are, you know, that are in that media, and that intends to deceive you, is misinformation and is, you know, unethical. And so I think that it's kind of slightly unfortunate that, well, I mean, it's unfortunate that most synthetic media is manipulative. You know, most 96% of the deepfakes out there are non-consensual porn. You know, they're face swapping of women's bodies, women's faces onto kind of porn stars' bodies. So, and then, you know, there have been some, as I say, that have been kind of satirical, there have been a few uses that have been a threat to security. But really, it's correct that most of the deep fakes out there are have been used for harm, but that doesn't mean that all synthetic media is bad. And in a way, if we had a term for kind of manipulation, essentially it's a manipulation, but just of a different type of media. Because when we came across this when we were making our project, we didn't know what to call it, because we're very clear in what we've done. It's not misleading. It's a creative alternative history that could well have happened. This is not something that is trying to harm or deceive people. And yet the word deep fake is what we call these things. So there are lots of uses of synthetic media that are already good right now. So there's a wonderful documentary called Welcome to Chechnya, which used deep fakes to superimpose other faces onto people who were donating their stories about being gay in Chechnya, where they would be by being identified, they would be at risk. And so they used deepfakes to hide their identity. Now that's not a deep fake. It's, you know, it's creative use of media, but really it's quite bulk standard. This is something in documentary making we do all the time. We blur people's faces, or we do creative things in media to obscure people's faces if they're going to be at risk. So that's something that is already now being used. Hollywood uses CGI, it uses all kinds of techniques to make creative entertainment. You know, it can be used for that. There's lots of uses in health at the moment. There's a wonderful company called Vocal ID, which allows people who are either losing their voices or who have no voice to either capture their voice before it goes, or to take a voice of someone who's donated it to them, so that they've got so that they have a voice. So that's synthetic voice. You know, it's the same technology as the synthetic Nixon or the deep fake voice that we used. It's just that I think that our terminology is a little confused, just because of that's the way that this synthetic media very rapidly came out, you know, really through Reddit channels. So we haven't really found a good terminology to use it. And, you know, actually when I talk to a lot of misinformation experts right now, they're much less worried about deep fakes than they are about cheap fakes. You know, there was a lot of talk about the concerns about manipulation of the election that we've just had, and actually all of the political misinformation that we had, video misinformation that we had, was all cheap fake. You know, it was all very easily manipulated video through editing, slowing down, you know, slow Pelosi, editing words here and there, sleeping Biden. All of that is just very simple editing. So it's not to say that deep fakes aren't a concern, but really the main concern at the moment that misinformation experts are talking about is the actual erosion of truth. And, you know, this is something we're seeing this week, which is how, you know, what are the ways that you can destabilize what people think is real, not real. You know, one way is to go on to broadcast TV and say, I won the election, when it's not true. You know, that is one way to do it. Another is to say, prove this is true. It could be a deep fake. And, you know, a lot of the experts that I've talked to have said it's not actually the deep fakes themselves that are the risk. It's the deniability of all media, to be able to point to anything and say, prove it. It's, you know, and it's very, very hard to prove things, as we know. It's much easier to prove something is false than it's true. So they call it the liar's dividend, the idea that this erosion of truths means that you can deny everything around you, which just destabilizes, you know, destabilizes reality, essentially. And, you know, this is exactly where we are now. And as we can all see, it's a really, really dangerous and unsettling place to be in. And, you know, I'm sure you all have found this week very, very difficult, because it's very difficult to know where this is going when you're getting these alternative narratives which are trying to destabilize the world around us by just saying these votes are not legal when they absolutely are. Now, that's a very simple case of, you know, of misinformation, but it shows actually that all of these things added together, is not just that the deep fakes are the worrying bit, it's that deep fakes are part of a landscape of misinformation that are making things really, really worrying right now. Now your question was the opposite. It was, you know, how can synthetic media be used in positive ways? And certainly, you know, I really like to talk about our project as being a really good example of that. You know, yes, it's trying to educate about what misinformation is and try and make people aware of how they can be deceived, but actually it's also a creative art project. It's you know, it's an installation of an alternative, you know, of an alternative reality, which is creative and shows you a kind of a documentary possibility that could have happened, but in a very creative way. Now, I've been thinking a lot about how synthetic media can be used to create ideas of really positive futures, dystopian futures, as well as really positive futures as well, because, you know, with AI, you know, we can create videos of all kinds of worlds. We can also create retrospective possibilities as well. I'm really interested, as we've been talking a lot this year, about how history is told very much from one perspective, you know, from the victor's perspective, from the white male gaze. And this is the way that we are taught what our history is, could we be using synthetic media to tell the narratives that did happen, that have happened, but that aren't, that we don't see videos of, that we don't read books of? Like, that would be really interesting to be able to show, to have in history classes other videos of what really did happen, but that we don't have the documentary material of because it wasn't seen as important. So, this is because I come from, a non-fiction and a media background. So I think of this very much in terms of storytelling, but there are lots of people doing amazing work in much more abstract arts, who are creating really beautiful visualizations using synthetic media. There's people like Refik Anadol, Trevor Palin, people doing really beautiful AI work. That I don't know where that's going to go at 2070, but I see AI as a really interesting creative tool for artists to use. And I guess that's the way that the perspective that I see that as, just because that's the area that I'm working in. There's going to be amazing possibilities in all of the industries that can use synthetic media in different ways. But for me, it's got enormous creative potential.
Wow, thank you. I love the idea of alternative history. I think it's a fantastic idea. By the way, Francesca, Refik Anadol was talking to us last week.
There you go. He's great, isn't he?
Yeah, oh yeah, he's great. He's amazing. His work is just absolutely stunning. So
it's a very good example of synthetic media that's not called deep fake. I mean, it's not, he doesn't use figures very much, but he's creating deep fake buildings and cities, and because of the language that kind of manipulation of people specifically, and the potential that has, the language is not developed to show the possibilities of it.
So let's open the floor to questions. Any questions? Easton.
Hi.
Yeah, I thought of various things to ask while you're speaking, but I think the most interesting on my mind right now is whether it's imaginable for you, or since you probably put more thought into this than I have, that deep fake technology will have people somehow revert to a more old style of gathering information, in the sense that if everything I obtain information-wise, video, audio, written, whatever, from my computer, from the internet, is untrustworthy, does it mean that people are going to start being much more skeptical of that and only trust things that they can see with their bare eyes?
So I guess my answer would be maybe not just with their bare eyes, but that have a kind of verification process on it. So some of the experts that I've talked to, are thinking about ways to use things like blockchain to be essentially kind of stamping all kinds of, whether it's your location, whether it's media, sound, all kinds of information on what you're doing, so that it can be kind of proven. That this is a group called Witness, who do human rights work, and they do a lot of work trying to prove that people who have dealt with human rights atrocities, they can document them and show them. The problem about the idea of verification, so kind of living through verification, whether it's seeing it with your own eyes, or being able to say, look, here is the verification through whatever system we're capturing it in, is that it's very limiting in terms of who has access to those resources. I mean, certainly, actually that's still the case with your own eyes, like who gets to actually be there to see the events, but also who gets to have the app that allows you to verify things, that allows you, because these things use enormous resources, and who has its element of power. So there has been a lot of talk about the kind of mass verification system, but that is, I think, very risky. I mean, I can see why that's important, I also think it's very risky to then move to a world where, you know, it's a bit like the lies dividend that I was talking about, where essentially you're having to prove everything all the time. Is that the kind of world we want to live in, where essentially we're saying, I don't believe you unless you can prove it, A, by being here, B, by by showing me with this material. And so I would very much not like to move in that direction. I would prefer us to be trying to, you know, I guess my bigger feeling right at the moment, maybe this is just because of the week that we're in, is how can we rebuild trust and communications in society so that we're not right now we're fueling misinformation because we're dividing society and increasingly polarizing the world that we're in. And instead of thinking about how technology can either, you know, save us through verification or harm us through deep fakes, I guess I feel like we really need to go to the root problem and figure out, like, why is society so deeply divided that we are doing these things to each other? Like, why do we need to be causing this harm to each other through misinformation and deep fakes? I mean, of course, misinformation has always existed, but our world is so polarized at the moment that it is ripe for using this kind of misinformation. So I feel like there is a kind of deeper exercise of healing, certainly that the States needs to go through, but actually many countries that are becoming increasingly fractured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like one thing that kind of haunts me a little bit is ever since I learned that a lot of memes, so like a lot of memes are generated by people who are sowing division. So a person who wants,
exactly.
People who want there to be more division will impersonate, say, a leftist and make a meme that is parodying a leftist point of view, so that right-wing people think, oh my gosh, look at these leftists and what they're saying. But actual people didn't even make those. So like I guess straw manning would be the term. This facilitates people to see a false vision of an adversary and distance two groups of people.
Yeah, and the technological systems that that we use, the platforms, the algorithmic bias is to favor the more polarizing content because it is financially more lucrative for these companies as well. So there are many layers in terms of solving the problem of division, of polarization, of misinformation.
Thank you. Cherry, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, my hand was raised, but then as they were talking, it was sort of, my mind started wandering. But I guess I could make either, like, this is more of a comment than a question. I always find it interesting how deepfake technology, or the kind of mechanisms we use to build these technologies, is also the same thing that we're using to combat them. So we're using AI to build deepfake, but we're also using AI in the same way to detect deepfakes, and from like body, like face body movements, or like a natural eye detection. Like, these are all still AI techniques. And the same thing with natural language processing, where you're using these systems to write fake articles and fake news, but you're also using natural language processing, the same thing, to detect fake news. Yeah. So I also find it interesting how this is sort of a double-edged sword. And in a way, when people think about arms race, I think a lot of times you still think about a race or sort of a combat in like a big border by border, sort of like a country versus country scale. Yeah. But I think with this kind of technology, it's sort of almost narrowing down the scale of how we're combating these issues. Like it's like AI versus AI, or like AI researchers versus AI researchers, or like AI technology, AI techniques versus AI techniques. So it's almost like which side of the technology is going to develop maybe beyond the other, in a way where it's just not gonna, maybe deepfake is gonna develop so much that even AI networks won't be able to detect them. Or maybe detection mechanisms are going to develop so much that we no longer have to worry about deepfakes. We just have to, whenever it comes up, we just have to detect it, clarify it, and tell everyone, oh, that was fake news.
The experts that I've spoken to about this, who are developing the detection software, they call it a cat and mouse game. Exactly, I can see you doing this, which is exactly, that's exactly what they say. They go like this, the deep fake comes, they figure out the pattern, then the people making the deep fakes come up with something slightly more sophisticated. They come up and so they say that essentially they will never fit. There's never going to be a detection system that just solves it for that reason, because people developing this will always develop something more sophisticated. But still, the people who are developing the software, the detection software, will be able to detect that. So that it's one element of solving the problem of this type of misinformation, and it has to happen because of the scale of it. So you're absolutely right that the AI does have to fight the AI, but it will never win. Neither side will probably ever win. But it's like one strand of solving this problem. Another strand is going to be what the platforms do, because so much of this content is distributed on platforms. So kind of regulation via the platforms, and also regulation via law. So there are various different countries and different states in the United States have put in legal restrictions for this particular type of misinformation. So far just around specific time periods around elections, but a lot of the legal scholars are thinking what can legislation look like around deepfake technology. And then the other is media awareness, and that's kind of where my project fits in, which is you can't just assume that the AI robots and the law is going to figure out this problem for us. We do need to have awareness. As I'm saying, it's not just the misinformation, is not just the deep fakes. It's like literally the president standing up in front of us saying, telling lies as well. So it's the awareness needs to be on every level. The cheap fake videos, the texts that we're getting about COVID-19 that are fake, the deep fakes, and awareness of how to check sources, how to think whether things are likely and realistic when they come to you, when to share information, what to look at before you do that, what to think about. So a lot of what the misinformation experts are coming up with at the moment is trying to come up with strategies of how to educate people with simple messages about how to consider the information that is being presented to them. So I see this as a kind of threefold attack on deepfakes, with AIs being an absolutely crucial one of those, but probably not one that is going to solve the problem on its own.
I think that's really interesting in that I feel like in a way this has never changed. It's just that technology has become more advanced, so the problem has become more complex. But in a way, even before all of this, there's always a problem where we tend to gravitate towards, let's say, articles that are written that have like humans naturally have confirmation bias, so we naturally gravitate towards things that we already believing, and we think, oh yeah, that's true just because that's what I think, so that's probably true. So I feel like in a way, I also don't think technologies like this are changing much of the structures and the processes that you are talking about when it comes to law or human behavior. I think in a way it's just becoming more advanced, and we have this natural tendency to be fearful of new things and new elements and new creations. But the very fundamental sort of techniques that we are using to debunk, I guess, conspiracies or debunk things that are fake, that has, I think at its core, it's never changed. Just like you said, it's a threefold problem. We're just, now that we're using AI to detect these mechanisms, because technology has advanced. But in terms of legal structures or in terms of social awareness, that's never really changed. And it's just become easier on social media platforms to widely spread misinformation. So it's interesting.
You're absolutely right. And actually the kind of psychologists say that the kind of, the more extreme, like fake news, people will click on are more likely to click on something that is novel and that looks fake, that looks extraordinary, a bit like gossip. It's like, if it's a bit salacious, if it's a bit unusual, you're more likely to have your ears pricked up. And so you're absolutely right that is just it. It's been proved as human nature, and the problem are our distribution models. That we used to have gatekeepers before, and now we don't. And so the mass distribution potential means that we're in a very different landscape, both distribution and production. So even though the deep fake that I created I couldn't do because it was, so complicated. There are face swapping apps that are very, very easy for anyone to use. They're pretty crude, but, enough to do an enormous amount of harm. And so, we can all now be producers of misinformation, and we can all be distributors of misinformation. And that means that is a very different landscape from 50 years ago, when there were, a very few outlets for misinformation. It still happened, but it was far fewer, and it was far more regulated by gatekeepers. So you're absolutely right on both points.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering how you've seen or any potentials for how this technology kind of changes, expands perception of what our bodies can do, of what we're capable of. 'Cause I remember I listened to the Brave Planet podcast that you were part of, and they talk about the ballerina example and stuff. I was wondering what other sorts of
and it's a lovely example, that, isn't it? Because it's now being used for people who, have don't have the same physical capacities for movement, but giving them the capacity to be able to visualize themselves as dancing. I haven't seen any kind of neuroscience experiments on what that like actually categorically does, internally to yourself, if you watch yourself performing as, a world-class dancer, like what that internal effect is. I can kind of anecdotally say, from having done experiences in VR where I've been given virtual bodies and being, I've done kind of social VR experiments where you are given another body and you interact with other people, that you certainly, at least I have certainly had a very different idea of like myself physically, and also of your identity when you're given another persona and you're put with another group of people. So I think actually I've done a few of these AI things which do get you to move in different, in different ways. And I have found it really interesting, kind of psychologically, what the effect of that is. It's just that I've got no data to be able to stand that up. But I think that's I think that's such an interesting area to explore.
That's fascinating.
Just a heads up that I'm going to have to go in 9 minutes, so I can take a few more questions, or if there's anything specific else that you want to get out of this time before I have to go.
So who's got a burning question that they absolutely need to ask?
Yeah, what the world might have been if 9/11 had failed? I would like to see that world. I'm just reading your comments.
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see this going beyond like the very elite and very privileged academic spaces? MIT has been criticized in the past, like especially at the Media Lab and stuff like that, for being kind of, not that this is your project at all, but like making technology to make technology, and then the message and the goal come after. And I'm wondering like how you see how virtuality fits into this.
So I guess there's virtuality in general, and then there's AI. So, some of the projects that I like the most, the kind of virtuality projects that I found the most creative, have been those on Instagram recently. Alternative. There's a wonderful project that I was just looking at last night called Sylvia, which was actually it's an AI created woman who is kind of aging at a very, very fast rate, and she started life in her 40s at the beginning of COVID, and I think is going to die by the end of the year. And it's just this very, very moving persona that they've created via AI. But there've also been, really interesting experiments on Instagram that have been through just actors, creating other worlds and other situations, which I think are, I would say that is virtuality, and is really accessible to anyone with a phone who wants to create imaginative other kind of, layering on other worlds into this real one. So I think, you know, I've worked in VR for a long time, and now this expensive AI project, and those, you know, those have been expensive projects, but especially, you know, I actually think that the stuff that's most interesting is the stuff that's really accessible on platforms that lots of people have. I think TikTok is one of the most interesting platforms at the moment in terms of, you know, layering, kind of mixing different versions, collaborative storytelling. You know, that is a really fascinating place to be creating kind of layered experiences. So yeah, you're right that you know, elite institutions have got possibilities that other places don't, but I also think that that actually using platforms that a lot of people have access to and taking what's available to those and really using them creatively is kind of the most interesting thing for me at the moment.
Okay, I got time for one more question. So, go ahead, Damon.
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's a very, very, very quick question. I wonder, Francesca, do we see a glimmer of hope in rising tech literacy being a solution to this? Because it occurs to me that, like, you know, technology in its, you know, age of wonder manifestation, you know, when it first was integrated into society as this sort of, you know, miracle that we can identify it as now, its role was very verificatory. It was very much in the enterprise of disambiguation.
Yeah.
And I'm told, I mean, I'm no authority, obviously, on computer science, but my understanding is that competent computer scientists can tell whether or not something has been edited visually. And so if we were to have this competency, we'd be able to verify for ourselves whether or not something was an illusion. When it seems that a problem technology can't fix for those who don't understand technology is the problem of trust, right? And so we might rely on ourselves if we were to, say, learn coding languages in public schools or something to that effect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, I think that we've already seen the development in terms of people's understanding of technology and things like video editing and you know, Photoshop. Like, we understand techniques that are used that we didn't understand, you know, 30 years ago, because only the real experts would airbrush, you know, models on adverts. And now we see pictures and we know that they've been altered because we understand the technology, we understand the software because we're using it. And I think you're right that as essentially we all become producers and makers because we are making media all the time, the more that we are skilled in terms of, you know, whether it's the coding or whether it's the tools that are available, you know, the AI tools or the, you know, the simpler creative tools, the more that we are evolved in making things, the more we understand what is possible in terms of manipulation. So, you know, although the harm that comes out with is, you know, that we can all be producers of misinformation, it also means that we all understand the techniques much better. So I think you're absolutely right that, you know, as we have generations of people who are understand what is possible with, you know, both simple coding but also deep learning techniques, that as audiences will be less susceptible to them because it'll become you know, it's less novel. I mean, we find that, don't we, always with media, that the novel techniques are the ones you know, that deceive because they're new and we're not expecting them. And that's why there's been so much press about deep fakes, is because, you know, we're not used to seeing this type of media manipulation. But once everyone can do it and everyone can, you know, hopefully make really creative pieces of synthetic media, people will be, you know, more prone to think about how likely is this to be manipulated, and, you know, should I check this out? What's the source of it? So I think that's a really good point, and not something I had particularly thought of before, especially about kind of technical literacy. And I've been thinking a lot about media literacy, but I think you're absolutely right that it's also technical literacy.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Francesca, for the time you took. Thank you. Really we hope we'll be able to speak to you again or other people in your lab. We'd be happy to keep on engaging. Those are just fascinating questions. And congratulations on that Nixon clip. It was just,
Thank
it was just amazing. I keep showing it to people, said, look what they found in the archive. It's just fun.
Oh dear, don't spread misinformation.
No, I always tell them afterwards.
All right, lovely to meet you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.